Order.
Certainly got our lead.
The Lord be with you.
And also with you.
Good morning. And this is the baptism of the Lord Sunday, the first Sunday in Epiphany. So remember that. And today, because of the elevator, we have a group of people downstairs in the Westminster room zooming in. I hope.
I hope so too.
So in a moment, I'm going to go downstairs and sit with that.
It's not working. I went down there and what was it's not working.
The Zoom?
I announced it when I came here.
Okay, there's a laptop, so we'll get it worked out.
There's some people down there.
Right. And it's our pleasure, our honor to welcome Krystyn Moon, who is Professor of History and American Studies at the University of Mary Washington, and is going to be talking about her new book, Proximity to Power. In a moment, Melinda will introduce her. But let us begin with prayer. Gracious God, our baptismal vows call us to compassion and mercy on behalf of those in need. And so this day we offer our prayers for the church and the world. Oh God, you revealed your Son in the waters of the Jordan and anointed him with the power of the Holy Spirit to proclaim good news to all people. Sanctify us by that same Spirit, that we may proclaim the healing power of the gospel by acts of love in your name. In the name of Christ the Lord, we pray. Amen. Welcome. And again, excuse me,
You're gonna go do tech duty. Yeah.
Wonderful.
And I have the pleasure of introducing our speaker today. Dr. Krystyn Moon is a professor of history and American studies at University of Mary Washington and a resident of Alexandria who has worked closely with the Office of Historic Alexandria on numerous projects during her career. Krystyn's research was very helpful to me as I was writing Faith and Race, the history of Westminster. She's previously joined us here at Westminster to discuss housing policies in the city that led to redlining, discrimination, and the racial segregation and disparities between our public schools that we continue to grapple with in our city today. Now she's back to talk about her latest book, Proximity to Power, Rethinking Race and Place in Alexandria, Virginia, in which she writes about the city's relationship with the federal government before, during, and after the Civil War. I really enjoyed reading her book, and Krystyn, we are very grateful that you could join us today. Welcome.
Thank you, Melinda, for that great introduction. And thank you all for joining me on an early Sunday morning. I actually start my day at 5:30, so I know I'm like ready to go. I realize for other folks that might be a lot, but that's okay. So a little bit more about myself. I've been doing public history work here in Alexandria for 15 years, but for the last 10 years, I've been working on this book project on and off. Part of the reason why I decided to do this book is because through my public history work, I was listening to our community elders about all these amazing stories of adversity and resilience, but those stories aren't necessarily being documented all the time. And more importantly, while we might know our stories, people outside of Alexandria don't at all. This sort of was driven home when I ended up talking to the editors at UNC Press, one of whom happened to have done research in Alexandria and pointed out that the academia hasn't really dealt with Alexandria as a historical subject because, as he said it, it's just too darn hard. Mm-hmm. Did we know that? I did not until I took 10 years to write this book. And we can talk about some of those logistical issues as well. This book is not an and-all be-all of African American history. So I want to make sure everybody realizes that first. But second, what the point of this book is to talk about how the various forms of adversity that impacted Black residents here from the Civil War to basically the present, everything from violence to segregation to inequities in education and access to housing, that the strategies that Black residents use to improve their lives, the lives of their friends, their families, and their neighborhoods are unique to our community. And they're unique because we're near the nation's capital. We don't see anything like what we see here going on in Black communities elsewhere, not just in the South, but in the entire nation. And that's something what we should celebrate and sort of tell people about us as Alexandria. Before I go on, I want to sort of talk about what you're looking at. These are in many ways the faces of Alexandria that I'll be talking about, and I will talk about the folks on these slides just so you get to know them a little bit. First and foremost, I want to talk about this gentleman right here. I don't know if anybody remembers him, but his name was Ira Robinson. He was a lawyer from Richmond who moved to DC, like many people, because he was able to get a government contract job in the 1960s. However, because of racial inequalities here, he decided to run for local office, and he was our first African-American city council member since Reconstruction. Now, Ira Robinson actually had moved to California, and before he passed away in 2024, I was able to talk with him. And my email exchange with him is actually the closing of the book. So I do hope you check it out, because his words are the words I want us to sort of reflect on. Definitely, I reflected on them. The other image is actually from the Civil War. And I hope you notice the two men standing in the background. They are most likely Union soldiers, staring on to this unnamed woman, we presume, who had been newly emancipated, but we really don't know anything about her status. But this is probably one of the most powerful photos of the Civil War, her looking directly into that camera. It's sort of our story, and I'll get a little bit more into the Civil War aspect as well. The next photo is actually the teachers of Parker Gray School. This is our segregated elementary school that is created in 1920. All of these teachers attended Howard University except for one, and many of them actually also lived in DC because they couldn't find adequate housing here in Alexandria. And finally, last but certainly not least, this is the photograph of the men leaving the Alexandria Public Library in 1939 in their failed attempt to desegregate through a sit-in that year. This sit-in, of course, was organized by Samuel Tucker, a graduate of Howard University who had been trained in civil disobedience. He, of course, would go on and be the lead NAACP attorney in Brown versus Board to desegregate our schools, born and raised in Alexandria. All right, a little bit of a roadmap. There are three major themes that work through this book. First is education, second employment, and then three housing. I realize you all can read that, but I'm just going to say it out loud. The last bit, I'm going to talk about how we grapple with this past. This is really the last chapter of this book. Hopefully I don't talk too much. If you have questions, just let me know. In terms of, hold on, we're missing, something happened. All right, we're just going to work with it. There was supposed to be a map. And I don't know why it's not there, but that's okay. The first major theme in the book is education. The story of education and African-American access to education is actually quite amazing, because in most places in the South, there's not a narrative about antebellum educational access for free Black residents. But in Alexandria, we can say that, because prior to 1846, we were not Alexandria, VA. We are Alexandria, DC. And in Alexandria, DC, we are allowed to have private academies to educate African-American children. Unfortunately, though, when we became Alexandria, VA, all of those schools were required to close. That's important because that foregrounds what will happen during the American Civil War. That's only 15 years after what we call retrocession. Retrocession is a fancy word of basically saying that Virginia and DC decided to give Alexandria, present-day Arlington County, back to Virginia. In April of 1861, of course, Union forces come into Alexandria. I would like you to know that Alexandria was part of the Confederacy for less than 24 hours. This is Union territory, and solidly so for the duration of the war. There's plenty of markers and whatnot in the city that might make you think otherwise, but the reality is this is the Union space, and we'll get into the reasons why Alexandria is so important to the Union Army during this time. Within months of Union forces arriving, 4 Black women actually established schools here in Alexandria. This is exceptional. We don't see this anywhere else in the South. Why is this happening? Because they have gotten education elsewhere. One of those women is a woman named Jane Grey. And I want that last name to stay with you because you know this last name, even though you don't know you know this last name. Jane Grey starts teaching in the summer of 1861. She herself actually had studied in Baltimore and then had gone to DC to a school run by a Quaker woman named Myrtilla Minor. Don't say that too fast because that one's a tough one. Myrtilla Minor. She created a school for Black women interested in education. As a result, Jane Grey would teach for the duration of the war. She would then go on to teach for the Freedmen's Bureau after the war. And in 1870, she became one of our first Black public school teachers. She would teach here in Alexandria until her death in the 1890s. An incredible 40-year career of education here. But she is not alone. And in fact, there are dozens of teachers, both Black and white, who come to Alexandria during the Civil War. When just looking into Fairfax or Stafford or any of these other places, we do not see the type of education going on during the war. It is really amazing. One of the women, probably the most famous woman who becomes an educator here is in this photo. It's Harriet Jacobs. Harriet Jacobs, who is a well-known writer of the time, she wrote a slave narrative that made her nationally recognized, decided in 1863 and 1864 to come to Alexandria and to establish a school. This is actually a photo of her and her students. She has over 100 students that she's trying to teach with her daughter, Louise. And if you notice, there's a little X, you guys see it? Yeah. We think that is trying to mark where Harriet Jacobs is in that. It's pretty amazing.
Krystyn,
Yeah.
it's a little off topic, but you mentioned that Alexandria was in Union hands. Where were there sort of Confederate raids into the city, or was it pretty secure? And
It was pretty secure, but basically Falls Church is your no man's land.
Okay.
Right, the
I was just gonna ask
moment,
what the
yeah.
perimeter is.
Yeah, so we're going to have a sidebar conversation. So what we have very early in the war is the creation of the defenses of Washington. This is a 70+ forts, including places like Fort Ward, right? If folks know Fort Ward, Fort Worth, Fort Williams, right? We got a lot of W's going on there. There's other forts down sort of across Holmes Run, and then of course through Arlington County as well. This is like the line that sort of holds between the Union and the Confederacy in this region. Now that said, in Falls Church, we see, for example, people like Mosby raiding the residents there. And in fact, there was a white Quaker who was trying to be a teacher in 1864, and Mosby's men kidnapped him and murdered him for being a teacher of Black children in Falls Church. So again, it's not that far, the divide, but we are solidly Union territory. So I'm glad you asked. There's a wonderful book on the history of the defenses of Washington that you can get on Amazon if you want to learn more about that history. It's a pretty interesting one, and it's literally on our built environment if you go to Fort Ward. So hopefully that is helpful.
Thank you.
Yeah. So as I mentioned before, and again, ask me questions. Mentioned before, public education starts in Virginia, not just Alexandria, in 1870. It was actually part of our brand new Constitution that also included the end of slavery as well as racial equality. We had to incorporate the 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendment in terms of the new state constitution, and that included education. Now, education from its inception was segregated, but it was segregated in two ways, both by race, but also by gender. We did not have co-education until the early part of the 20th century. That's something that we often forget about. From its inception, however, Black residents quickly realized that the opportunities for their children were not going to be the same as white children. Parents, however, who had the money and means didn't just take it. They decided to figure out a new strategy to get around that. They didn't have to go far. They turned to DC. DC at this time, which created public education in 1862, was seen as one of the premier places for Black education in the late 19th century. In fact, M Street High School, mind you, African Americans didn't even have high school here until 1930s. M Street High School, as well as Howard University, which offered a high school program, were seen as premier programs in the entire nation. And so parents over here looking, going, why can't we have this here, decide to put their kids on trains, ferries, streetcars, and buses so they can access a quality education. And we have tons of stories of people doing this, including people like Samuel Tucker. His family had to do that for him as well. Now, you might wonder, how are they pulling that off? Well, because DC has so many politicians and civil servants coming in and out, they had very loose residency policies in terms of who could go to public school. They, in fact, aren't even successful in sort of ratcheting it in until the early part of the 20th century. To change their policies, by the way, they needed an act of Congress. So it was really tough for them to change their residency policy. And in fact, Black families are doing this up and through the 1950s, well through Brown versus Board, so that they could have access to this education. That doesn't mean that, of course, we don't have education going here, but some of it, again, speaks to some of these inequities. This photo in the upper right here, you see the young women standing in front of a school building. This is actually the Hallowell School that was built in 1867. It is still actively being in use by 1915. In fact, it's in use through 1920. Meanwhile, white children are going to school in a brick building with things like flushing toilets and electricity, but African-American children do not have access to those sort of basic things that we often take for granted even today. What is the game changer is that in the 19-teens, the school for boys, which was known as the Snowden School, actually burned to the ground while the children were at recess. The destruction of that school led to a call by parents to say, we need better buildings for our kids. And thus, the Parker Gray School, which is this photo right here, was opened in 1920. This was only an elementary school. It would be expanded to a middle school and high school by the 1930s. I want to talk about some of the other images here. This school right here, this would be our second African-American elementary school here in Alexandria, but you probably all know it by a different name because this school is at the site of the Alexandria City High School. This school was actually known as the Seminary School, and it was built in the 1920s by a man named Julius Rosenwald. Now, Rosenwald was the head, of Sears Roebuck in Chicago, and he had met Booker T. Washington. And one of the things that Booker T. Washington talked to him about is how problematic the school buildings were in the South for Black children. As a result of those conversations, Rosenwald put up money to help families throughout the South build new school buildings. There were over 300 Rosenwald schools built in Virginia. Unfortunately, because many communities did not think they were historically significant, they were almost all torn down. So that's one of our sort of big historic press issues in terms of Black history. We're going to sort of get into that in a little bit as well. The last two photos here, these two young women, this is actually from the Dunbar High School yearbook from 1924. What's fun about these two women is they're seniors. This is their senior portraits, very serious. But what's great about Dunbar is they were very open about the fact that most of their students were not from DC, and it actually says they're from Alexandria, Virginia in the yearbook. It's just that, that's how it was. All right. The second major theme of the book looks at employment, much of which, of course, some of you have experienced perhaps working for the federal government or a government contractor, you know somebody who has, perhaps you're married to somebody who has, or kids, right? There's a reason why a lot of us live here in the Washington metropolitan area. That phenomenon ultimately here in Alexandria starts with the Civil War. As I mentioned before, this town was part of the Union from basically the beginning of the war. It becomes the major transportation hub for both soldiers and sailors, along with supplies in the war front. We're talking about moving thousands of people as well as goods in and out of this town to serve the war effort. How do you make that happen? You need thousands of workers on the back end, and African Americans respond. Many of them self-emancipate themselves from the region, often places out like, say, Winchester, or even down towards Orange County, etc. They walk to Alexandria, often holding children with anything they can carry, and they become part of the Union effort. We have at least 7,000 African Americans living in the city by the end of the war. We are close to 2,000 at the beginning of the war, right? So that's the population shift, the huge numbers. And we're going to talk about the significance of that in other ways as well. African American women and men are doing all sorts of jobs supporting the war effort. Here are some photos. You can see they're actually building what we call a picket or a palisade. You were wondering how they kept the Confederates out. Now you can see literally they're cutting logs and putting sharp spikes on them to make sure that people aren't climbing over that thing. They're also working on our waterfront, helping to supply boats, often loading them up with coal, because that's what, of course, the fuel they'd be using at the time, but other things too, most notably hardtack. We have huge bakeries here in Alexandria to feed the Union Army. And has anybody tried hardtack? It's awful. It's awful, but you know what? It's hardtack for a reason. You can soak it in coffee and you can eat it. Yeah, but that was created here in Alexandria. We're making it here. Women work too. They cooked, they nursed the sick and dying, and they did also various domestic responsibilities as well, many of whom were federal employees. After the war, of course, our economy is going to contract. We're going to have a recession here because wartime mobilization allows for all these jobs and people leave. But because of that initial contact that African Americans are having with civil servants in the military, many of them use those relations, especially those who are amongst the Black elite, to get various jobs in Washington, D.C. One of the most famous is this person right here. I was going to say the man with the mustache, but all four of them have mustaches. So that probably is going to be confusing. But this person standing on the right, his name is Freeman H.M. Murray. Now, Murray was born in Ohio. In the 1880s, he took the federal civil service exam. He did very well, and he was offered a job to be a clerk in the pension bureau. He moved to Alexandria, and for the next 20 years, he commuted on the train and sometimes the ferry to work at the pension bureau. But that's not also why he is significant. He, in many ways, represents this large number of African Americans who are part of the civil service in the late 19th century who live here in town. Of course, he would go on to other things too. Perhaps you noticed the man in the chair. Anybody know who that is? That is W.E.B. Du Bois. Freeman H.M. Murray helps found the NAACP. He is part of what's known as the Niagara Movement, and he actually helps Du Bois generate interest because he has started a business in DC known as Murray and Sons. He's a publisher and editor. And he publishes and edits all sorts of things for African Americans, but he actually, for Du Bois, publishes a journal known as The Horizon, which will eventually be known as The Crisis. So he's an incredibly sort of important person. His house, by the way, has been torn down, but it was diagonally across from Meade Memorial Episcopal Church here in Alexandria. So he continued working and commuting until his death. And in fact, he died like at the age of 93, crossing the street after commuting from work. Yeah, in 1950. The other photos here talk about federal government's presence here in Alexandria itself. So that's the other thing too. Of course, people are commuting, but also as the federal government sort of outgrows the footprint of the District of Columbia, its physical presence sort of bleeds into Northern Virginia. I mean, we see it with the Pentagon, right, with Arlington, with CIA headquarters, but here in Alexandria, sort of ground zero is the torpedo factory. Torpedo factory, of course, was established in 1918 and created torpedoes, but unfortunately it opened, or they started building it on Armistice Day, so the end of the war.
Right.
Bad timing, but they made some torpedoes until 1922. This photo up here is actually the construction of the torpedo factory from the National Archives. And we know that African Americans worked on building that torpedo factory. It's a multi-building structure, actually. You can sort of see what's going on. It's kind of wild. Of course, and I'll talk a little bit more about that in a second. We also have other sort of federal employment programs here as well, particularly during the New Deal with the CCC, the Civilian Conservation Corps, created by President Franklin Delano Roosevelt to help employ young men in particular who were unemployed during the Great Depression. One of the major CCC projects here, besides the school over there, and sort of that mess I hadn't seen it yet, was actually down on Jones Point. There were African-American men who were charged with cleaning up all the industrial waste down on Jones Point in the 1930s, and that's what this photo is here. The last photo I want to talk about is this one in the upper right. This is also the torpedo factory, but this is the torpedo factory in a different role. After World War II, when it stopped making torpedoes, it became home to the German captured papers. And I want you to note that staff. This is an integrated staff. Because of Executive Order 4102 by President Franklin Delano Roosevelt, which required the desegregation of the defense industries starting in 1940, we will start to see desegregation in federal facilities even before the passage of the Civil Rights Act, or quite frankly, this is before Brown versus Board in 1954. So it's sort of extraordinary to see this, but also what's extraordinary is what they are doing. They're processing the German captured papers. These are the papers that Allied forces would collect as they pushed through Europe after landing at Normandy. They would just go into Nazi offices and like scrape the desk and throw it in a box and send it to Alexandria and let us sort out what it is. They brought in a bunch of German language specialists to go through these materials. And of course, once they sorted them all out, they used them to document the Holocaust and as evidence for the Nuremberg trials. So pretty important role in terms of documenting a genocide.
Do you know where those papers reside now?
Yes, I do. So what happened was the National Archives actually microfilmed all those papers and they have them within their collections. And then they returned those papers to the respective either towns or villages, or if they're Nazi papers, to Germany. So it's part of the Marshall Plan, actually, to restore their records to them. So a lot of times they accidentally would grab things like they didn't mean to, like they'd go into a city hall in a small French village and they take all their city council minutes, for example. So they were like, you know, they weren't paying attention. So they had to fix some of that. But yeah, we have those in microfilm form. The last sort of major theme in this book project talks about housing. Again, we're going to start with the Civil War. Remember, I talked about all this employment opportunities in Alexandria as a result of the war. We have thousands of people. Guess what? We don't have enough housing. And in the fall of 1862, we have a humanitarian crisis because we do not have enough housing. As a result, local military in Alexandria say we need to build emergency refugee housing for these families coming in. They don't have money. And we just don't have enough space. Remember, there's also thousands of soldiers and sailors here too, right? They have so many people they got to take care of. And so in the winter of 1862 to 1863, we have the first example of refugee housing in US history being built here in Alexandria. This is not great housing. This is barrack housing. And if you can imagine as a family, like trying to navigate living in a barrack, that's pretty rough. Most African Americans, they would use that temporarily, and then they would actually move out and move into either a pre-existing Black neighborhood, or we established new ones during the war as well. So if you know Alexandria's Black neighborhoods pre-Civil War, Hayti and Bottoms, which are south of King Street, those date from the early 18 teens. But then during the Civil War, our new neighborhoods would be, one is known as Grantville, that became known as Petersburg, that became the Burg. And the other was known as Newtown, became Uptown, and we all know it today as Parker Gray. These were all created during the Civil War by people coming into Alexandria and needing a safe place to live. The Civil War is also a missed opportunity in terms of the history of slavery, in that here in Alexandria, we confiscated a lot of property from Confederate sympathizers. But instead of taking that property and reallocating it to newly emancipated people so that they would have a modicum of economic stability or arguably even generational wealth, those properties were sold to real estate speculators and developers, and quite frankly, cronies in the Union civil service. Many of the same people, for example, selling the property, would have their wife buy it.
Yeah.
Super shady. There's over 119 properties sold here in Alexandria during the war. Only 3 go to African Americans. One of those is sold to a woman named Harriet Williams. Harriet Williams, this is a note that she wrote. Harriet Williams she lived independently. She was enslaved to the Lindsay family, but she owned or rented a house owned by the Dixon family. In 1863, we're pretty sure that there was some sort of understanding that when that house went up for auction, that she could buy it for $10. I will tell you, nothing sold for $10 in 1863 through the Confiscation Act. They usually went for hundreds of bucks. And just imagine house going for our $10 here, it just blows your mind, right? Because we're considering what property costs like today, right? $10 in Old Town, wow. Can't even imagine. Unfortunately for Harriet Williams, the Dixon family returned after the war. They received what's known as a redemptioner certificate from then President Johnson, which meant that they could reacquire all the land that had been taken during the war, including the property sold to Harriet Williams. Williams would not go down without a fight. She actually took it all the way to the state Supreme Court, where she ultimately lost. And even after losing there, she refused to move out. In fact, the Alexandria sheriff had to forcibly evict her in November of 1867. That's what you're seeing here. This is her note to Oliver Otis Howard, the director of the Freedmen's Bureau, asking for assistance. But not only do we have that note, we have Howard's response, and he tells his staff to help her, and he notes that she has been treated poorly here at Alexandria. Despite the story of Harriet Williams, we also see African Americans throughout the late 19th century buying homes and buying land. One example, for example, is in the middle of this side is Sunnyside. Anybody know where Sunnyside is? Because we are less than a mile from it. Okay, you're going to learn little new geography. So Sunnyside was first purchased by the Watson family in 1870. And in 1905, they platted a subdivision for African American, presumably civil servants, who were commuting on streetcars into DC. If you go sort of down the hill towards Glebe and you see Elbert Ave and Charles Ave right near Presidential Gardens, that's Sunnyside. It's that close. At that time, this of course was Alexandria County, also known as Arlington County, but it becomes part of Alexandria in 1930 when we annex this area from Arlington County. one of some of these extraordinary stories, and there are others, of course, as well. In addition, though, in the early part of the 20th century, we see the rise of various housing segregationist practices. One is the one I talked about a couple years ago here at the church about racially restrictive covenants, as well as land use zoning, eminent domain, urban renewal projects, public housing construction, etc., all of which targeted Black neighborhoods. I don't know if you're interested, but this is a QR code. This will take you to a map that I've created of all the racial restrictions here in Alexandria. There's over 8,000 lines of data for Alexandria. We've also mapped all of Northern Virginia. We're not done with Fairfax. We have over 50,000 lines of data that represent the racial covenants in our entire region. So if you want to go check that out, you're welcome. It requires you taking your phone and doing this, but can I stop share and show it? Is that okay? I don't know if the folks online will be able to see it. So this is the website where we built it. This is a little sluggish, but that's okay. Oh, okay. You see nothing. Do you see anything? No, you see nothing. What do you guys see? Hold on. I'm going to try to share again. There we go. Yay! All right. Sorry, I had to stop share, start share, and all that fun stuff. So this is actually the map. It is an interactive map if you want to check it out. And you can select a parcel, and you can sort of see sort of near Westminster over here. Right, that's actually George Mason. All the different properties with racial covenants in this area. And you can, again, select, and I'll show you the subdivision name, the year, and also the language. Okay, if you want to ever check that out. Sorry, I have to stop share, start share. All right. Because of the various segregationist practices at work in Alexandria, we also see an incredible amount of activism related to housing discrimination. Particularly awareness raising through groups like Access, which this is the photo. If you see the end apartment segregation sign, this group organized marches and pickets throughout our region. Their most famous was when they decided to walk all of 495 and nobody got hit by a car, which is amazing, to again raise awareness. But the other is sort of getting down and dirty and really fighting this stuff. And that is sort of led by people like Marion I. Johnson, Lieutenant Colonel Marion I. Johnson. He's originally from Texas and he's stationed at Fort Belvoir. He actually lives in the Seminary neighborhood. And in 1959, the city decided to flatten his neighborhood to build a high school. That high school would be called at that time, T.C. Williams High School. Because of Johnson, who at the time was a leader in the NAACP as well as other civic associations, he decided to fight this, bring in lawyers, and also to make connections with the federal government, which was funding this project. He helped to get the city to put aside land for those families being displaced by the construction of the high school. Those houses still stand along Quaker Lane. So if you drive down Quaker Lane, like from the hot mess of Braddock and King, right? And the houses on the left, you see some Ramblers and Cape Cods. That is thanks to people like Marion Johnson, who got the city to help house people who were being basically displaced through eminent domain to build that high school. Oh, the last photo, by the way, this is the integration of our public housing, which everybody thought wasn't going to happen and would be a mess. And it actually went to get pretty smoothly. So it's kind of a sweet photo from the Washington Star. Now I want to talk about the last part of the book that I've written, and that is dealing with how we grapple with our past. In terms of Black history, oftentimes we think of it as a phenomenon that starts in the 1960s, but that's not really true. African Americans in Alexandria, of course, are talking about Black history well into the 19th century. They're doing it by maintaining genealogies and Bibles. They're going to history talks in DC and elsewhere. And they're also organizing events such as Emancipation Day, which is basically like a 19th century version of Juneteenth. That was very popular here in Alexandria. But it's really in the 1950s and 60s where this becomes part of the public conversation about how we talk about our past. And one of the central figures in that story is a man named Krystyn R. He's the person in this photo. Krystyn R, born and raised here in Alexandria, was a school teacher. He taught U.S. history and Virginia studies. However, remember, this was a segregated school system, and quite frankly, the textbook did not do justice in any way, shape, or form to African American history, particularly after Brown versus Board, when the then Byrd machine required that they rewrite the textbook to double down on their racial politics. As a result, Krystyn R decided to decorate his classroom so that his children would know Black history, not through the textbook, but through all the different photographs and sort of posters that he decorated his classroom with. He traveled to DC, where he was able to acquire educational materials and just collected this stuff, like a lot of teachers do, and they collect a lot of this stuff. Fast forward to 1969. In 1969, students in the high schools here in Alexandria are protesting actually at school board, demanding that Black studies be incorporated into the K through 12 curriculum. This is actually ferried through and supported by the only African American on school board at that time, a man named Ferdinand Day. And of course, we have a school as well. Ferdinand Day helps to sort of ferry this through. It is approved by the school board, which is wonderful, except they have a problem. There is no curriculum. Nobody has created a K through 12 Black Studies program in the 1960s. And in fact, the state also approves it, and they throw up their hands. They don't have anything either. In comes Krystyn R. He's been collecting this stuff for 20, 30 years. And so they use all of his teaching materials to create our first Black Studies program here in Alexandria. And in fact, he has so much stuff that they decided to open a classroom during the summer, and they make a makeshift exhibit on Black history, and they make it open to the public. Word gets out. It starts to snowball. People ask him to come to other high schools. Then he's going to colleges and universities. And in fact, in this photo, he's at University of Pittsburgh, 1972. So much so that he's eventually invited during the Ford administration to install his teaching materials at the Department of Labor. And he has a one-on-one with the Secretary of Labor teaching him about Black history. Again, can't make this up. These are the stories of our community. Now, that said, while we have these types of extraordinary communities, we also have things that adversely impact African American residents. And one of the biggest is historic districts. In 1970, the City Council approved a report on sort of the state of the building structures in our city. They wanted to know what the oldest buildings were and where they were located. Up until that time, Black neighborhoods were not considered historic. But lo and behold, when this report was written, there were a lot of old buildings in Black neighborhoods here in Alexandria. As a result of that report, in 1973, City Council proposed the idea of expanding the old and historic district into what was then known as the Uptown neighborhood, which we now call Parker Gray. Residents they frothed. They had lost it. They were so angry, and City Council had no idea that this was coming. Led by this woman, Eudora Lyles, amongst others. They were outraged at this. They saw this as another segregationist tool that was basically going to raise the values of homes in the neighborhood, therefore raise the taxes in their neighborhood, therefore drive them out of Alexandria completely. For Eudora Lyles, this was not myth or folklore. In fact, her family had already lost their home in 1952 to eminent domain. Her parents were in their 80s. They lost pretty much everything. So that sort of trauma sort of guided her response to historic districts. In response to the Black community in Uptown saying, we don't want this, City Council decided to hire a consultant to do research on historic districts in 1973 to figure out whether or not it was true that it adversely impacted low-income residents as well as Black residents. And unsurprisingly, the answer is yes. And because of that report, City Council tabled the idea of expanding the old and historic district into Black neighborhoods in 1973. But this story is not done, because in 1983, we have the opening of the metro, and particularly the Braddock Road metro station, not too far from here, right? We can just roll down the hill, we'll be there. This particular metro stop had sort of pulled in white homeowners into the Uptown neighborhood, and they were petitioning City Council to expand the old and historic district. Eudora Lyles and others, again, fought this. City Council came back with a compromise. The compromise was to create a separate historic district known as the Parker Gray Historic District. Unfortunately, that actually didn't solve any problems. And in fact, Eudora Lyles filed a civil rights lawsuit against the city of Alexandria because it was basically pushing Black residents out through historic districts. HHS was charged with mediating this. Ultimately, in 1988, it washed its hands of the whole thing because City Council just wouldn't budge on anything. Gentrification is one of the biggest issues facing this city today. The result is tied to things like our historic districts. And we need to really come to terms with this. Even though, again, beautiful houses, we love them, but we got to also deal with the impact. Two other sort of historical aspects of our past. And again, if you notice, we're going back and forth, like in terms of positive and negative impacts here. The other is the creation of our community archaeology program, which was funded by the Department of the Interior and the Smithsonian. This program, which got local residents to volunteer and do archaeology, which is just so much fun. I don't know if you like to get dirty, going and doing archaeology is a great way to do it. I've done it myself. I've taken my kids. It's sort of a wonderful program. But what's also amazing about this early program is the first Black-owned house that they excavated is Harriet Williams. Remember, I told you her story before. In the 1970s, this was the first property they did. However, they thought she left in 1861. And only because of this book project, I was able to take her story through the war until 1867 and the forceful eviction of her. As well as the other thing we were able to answer because of the archival record was there was something in the archaeological record that we couldn't answer. And that is, this is a privy right here. And there in that privy, there was what we consider like a cataclysmic event, meaning like a whole bunch of stuff was dumped in the privy all at one time, many of her household goods. Most likely that was the forced eviction in 1867 when the sheriff threw her out of her house and then basically dumped her belongings into the privy. These two objects right here are restored objects from that privy. Thanks to Alexandria Archaeology. They photographed it. It's actually over in the Black History Museum. At least one of them is. I think this one's here on the left. And finally, a shout out to Garrett Fessler, one of our city archaeologists. In the background of this photograph, and again, I love firefighters, but sometimes we use photos for different things. The firefighters in the front, but if you see that two-story house in the middle, that's Harriet Williams' house. So we have actually a photograph. The last part of our history that we struggle with is how we memorialize our dead and how we treat Black cemeteries. This is an issue that is still ongoing, particularly as it relates to the Douglas Cemetery, which for far too long has dealt with a whole bunch of environmental abuses as well as basically abandonment. But probably the most famous of the cemeteries that we can speak to is the Freedmen's Cemetery. This cemetery was actually created during the American Civil War by the federal government as a place to bury newly emancipated people who had come into the city during the war. There are over 1,800 people buried there. Over half of them are children under the age of 5. These are folks, of course, facing various forms of hunger and disease, as well as dangerous, potentially living and working conditions. Unfortunately, the other thing that happens is because of the massive expansion of Northern Virginia as a result of the Cold War, this cemetery was erased from city documents and even maps. We literally, you can look at a AAA map, it will be on the map in 1940, it will not be on the map in 1947. That allowed the city then to sell that land, to build an office building and a gas station. I don't know if you all remember those being there on GW Parkway, on this cemetery. The irony of ironies is that it was because of the expansion of the Woodrow Wilson Highway at the behest of the National Highway Administration that this cemetery was rediscovered in preliminary research about this area. There was a huge expose by the Washington Post about it. In response, 2 residents, Louise Massoud and Lily Finkley, one black, one white, both civil servants, decided to mobilize people and create a group known as the Friends of Freedmen Cemetery. They wanted to document all the people who had been buried there, and if they could, find their descendants here and elsewhere in the DMV. They were successful with that. They went further. They got monies from the federal government to actually protect this cemetery, and in 2014 installed this beautiful memorial, which some of you I'm sure have driven by heading south on GW Parkway.
Right.
And thus the story of this book sort of comes full circle, starting with the Civil War and sort of ending with our memorialization of the Civil War, all of which again played to this relationship that we have with our nation's capital. So thank you very much. We can open up for questions. I did bring copies if you want to purchase them. They're like $20. So thank you.
Questions?
I seem to be the only,
You can ask me lots of questions. You're
Sure.
my plant,
so
right?
you made an interesting methodological statement that archival research is more difficult in Alexandria than elsewhere. Can you
Yeah.
talk a little bit about that?
Sure, and particularly because any sort of collections that we want to use, like Civil War research, is mostly in Washington, D.C., and we have so much archival material because of the Union military being here, thousands and thousands of pages. So it's not when it comes to the Civil War in Alexandria, it's not a sort of scarcity, it's an abundance problem. And so working through some of that was an incredible process. And then trying to keep it tight and succinct. I could have gone on the Civil War. And in fact, there's a local resident, Paula Whitaker, who's writing a book on the Civil War. So she is taking on that responsibility, which is great. But in other ways, we have huge gaps. Like in the late 19th century, it is very hard to find various types of collections, say like diaries or letters from African Americans here in Alexandria. But in the 20th century, we'll find them, right? So those types of hurdles really does make it difficult. And you have to work through local, state, and federal collections in order to write something like this. This is not just local history stuff. So that's also part of the logistics as well. So, yeah.
Could you talk a little bit about the Departmental Progressives Club?
Oh, sure.
And how that started and the influential people who were part of that and their role and
So the Departmental Progressive Club, which is actually the name, it's named because all of its founding members here at Alexandria work for various federal agencies or departments in Washington, D.C. It was a fraternal organization for Black men. It still is. And it was founded in 1926. So it's about to celebrate its centennial this year. And many of actually the Black men who I've talked about are a part of the Departmental Progressive Club. And so it's a huge sort of part of this history just writ large, but also it helped promote Black history work in our schools. They helped create basically the precursor to Black History Month. It was like a week-long program created by Woodson, who was a well-known historian who lived in DC, and they actually organized that for the public schools. So they do a lot of different things. They also play baseball. That was their other big thing in the early part of the 20th century. They have a good baseball team, apparently. It's all in the newspapers. So, yeah.
Just for a little more local context, can you say something about the Arlington County experience and how much it?
So which part? That's big too. Arlington has a lot of history too.
Close, South Arlington, close to here.
So what time period? Give me some.
Do you mean the contrast between Arlington and
Yeah,
Alexandria, or?
What was different about Alexandria when it was so close?
So some of the things that are different between, say, Arlington and Alexandria is the fact that Alexandria has this sort of deep, dense urban roots from the 18th century. And we see free people actually owning property, going to school, being supported by local Quakers, et cetera, by the 1790s and the 1800s. Because Arlington County is mostly rural, and in fact becomes more rural in the late 19th century. It's only the suburbanization that we sort of know that is Arlington. That's a 20th century phenomenon. A lot of the stuff, because of that sort of urbanness of Alexandria, is somewhat exceptional. And also like some of the just basic logistics, like train station and ferry lines came out of the waterfront right into DC. So those are some of the sort of big differences, is that rural urban divide that we see in those areas. And that Alexandria has a sort of a longer history of like free Black residents and activism as well. Hopefully that helps. Yeah. So yeah.
Question about the historic district.
Yeah.
Fight there.
Yeah.
And the thing I'm curious about is sort of why, if the residents did not want this, why did the city and maybe some of the people who were trying to come in and gentrify want it? Like, what did it do?
So there are two answers to that. So one is I do think the city wanted to try to protect older housing stock and structures. Right, number one. I do think that's part of the conversation. The problem is for Black residents who have been systematically marginalized, they don't care about Black buildings. They want Black families to be preserved. They want community elders to be able to not like have to choose between feeding themselves and a place, paying their taxes, right? I mean, that's sort of the frustration with that. But the other thing is that historic districts are a way to create economic value out of historic value. And that you can basically increase home prices through historic district making because it has cultural cachet. We see that in Georgetown as well as on Capitol Hill, and it's been documented elsewhere. Older housing stock, there's actually a wonderful study if you look, hopefully, I don't know if you can Google Philadelphia historic districts or historic housing and that stuff. They just came out this past year where they realized that the historic districts in Philly are some of the whitest, most affluent parts of Philly, but the places that are not in historic districts but have older housing stock are some of the most diverse middle and lower middle class neighborhoods in the city, right? And so that sort of divide is huge and sort of speaks to some of the problems with our historic districts. And I think we need to, they knew in 1973 what they did, right? They're gentrifying tools. I think it's hard for us to grapple with that impact because it is beautiful, right? The Old Town is beautiful. I don't disagree with that, but there's also a cost. hopefully that's helpful.
The Union occupied Alexandria in the Civil War, but then I get the impression that over time, Alexandria became sort of a Jim Crow town.
Mhm.
But how did that happen? I would have thought that it would be more like DC.
So this is where the being in Virginia part of that story matters. Many of our segregationist laws come from Richmond, not from Alexandria, and not from the federal government. Not all of them. And so that's why being on this side of the Potomac River really does matter. The one major asset that people have in Alexandria that they don't have in DC is access to the franchise until 1904. Because they removed, remember, home rule. You know, you've probably heard about home rule in DC. It's in the 1870s that Congress takes away home rule in DC, and it's not back until like the late 1960s, early 1970s. And so in terms of like political patronage systems, that's the one thing that folks on this side of the Potomac actually could leverage in terms of the federal government. But Jim Crow laws are being passed, like segregated public transportation, that's coming out of Richmond. Okay, so that's, I think, part of why it's sort of hard to sort of figure out the difference. And quite frankly, in DC, they, like, for example, try to create segregated public transportation there. Members of Congress from the South are trying to get it passed. It never passes. You don't have segregated public transportation in DC, but you do have other places that are segregated. Smithsonian is not segregated, but movie theaters are, restaurants are. Library of Congress is not segregated, but most of the private museums and galleries would be, right? So in DC, there's a very different sort of racial segregation politic, and they have segregated housing there too. Things like racial covenants are absolutely being used in the District of Columbia. And there are two women who are mapping that phenomenon as well. They do it in their free time. And in very much it's in conversation to what we're doing here. Hopefully that helps. I know it's not a one simple answer, but absolutely. Alexandria is a Jim Crow town. We see, segregated schools, segregated housing, every aspect is segregated.
Plus the political leadership in the city was very closely tied to the bird machine, even family members of the birds. And so that perpetuated the Jim Crow era.
Yeah, and only in the 1940s do we start to see Democrats, particularly people like Armistead Booth, who actually works with Lieutenant Colonel Marion I. Johnson to deal with the housing displacement with the building of Alexandria City. He starts to question some of these practices, and he gets blackballed for it. He gets ostracized within his own party when he starts to even have any sort of modicum of changing sort of the practice of segregation in the Democratic Party at that time. So yeah.
Thank you. Great job.
We got to get to
What should we do with this story?
educate yourself, educate your friends, talk about it at dinner. I think that's the sort of important takeaway from all of this. And that some of these issues, they aren't just the past, they are our present. They are why our communities look the way they do. They are why our schools function the way they do. They are why housing is so darn expensive here in Alexandria. It's not accident. It is in many ways a human-made problem. So, and we need to sort of work through them.
Thank you. Great job.